Hey, well, tonight I'm angry about incitement, and what I'm angry about is the fact that incitement doesn't even mean what it used to mean. We don't seem to remember what words even mean anymore. That incitement is a particularly interesting word because it has a legal history in this country. And before we talk about whether President Trump, ex-President Trump, I should say, or I guess he remains President Trump for life at this point, but before we talk about whether President Trump incited violence or not, let's take a look at the history of incitement and how the courts have ruled in this country on the idea of incitement. First of all, incitement is when you encourage, either through your emotions or your fiery speech, you encourage others or at least provide them the impetus to act in a criminal manner. And the question is your speech inciting them to that act? Are you liable? Are you liable for their actions? And there actually was a court case in the 60s and 70s in the US in Mississippi, an NAACP boycott organized of local stores. And the NAACP leaders gave very fiery speeches, and people were incited, and they did burn down stores, boycott them, loot them. There was a criminal case filed against the NAACP. Did they incite this violence? And the local court ruled that they had, and the Mississippi Supreme Court confirmed that they had, and then the case went to the US Supreme Court, and I will link to the ruling below. But in 1982, the Supreme Court ruled that the NAACP was not liable for the actions of people who had heard speeches, because the Supreme Court felt that if you could claim that somebody's speech, somebody's fiery rhetoric had incited somebody else to an act of violence, that you would be inhibiting free speech altogether. You can't be responsible for whether your speech incites someone to commit a criminal act if you do not urge them to commit that criminal act. And it was actually ruled that the law was to be very narrowly applied, that only if you had incited them to a specific criminal act could you be held liable. So now we come to the events of last week, where Donald Trump encouraged his supporters to give voice to the idea that the election results were fraudulent. And I will point out that he did suggest and encourage them to assemble peacefully, to march peacefully, but to make their voices heard. It really is a reach to claim that because the president encouraged his supporters to be heard, that he was inciting violence. First of all, if you look through all of his texts and commentary, he never did incite violence, nor did he encourage violence. As a matter of fact, he encouraged his supporters to gather peacefully, but to have their voices be heard. And the question is, where does the First Amendment end? Are you no longer allowed to speak against any group? You know, in 2000, there was a disputed election. In 2016, there was a disputed election. In 2020, there was a disputed election. Or at least I should say, only in 2020 was there not a disputed election. But the fact is that political speech, fiery rhetoric, encouraging your supporters to take actions, these are not criminal acts. If your supporters far exceed the instructions you gave them, the encouragement that you gave them, and they commit violent acts, you are not responsible. The US Supreme Court ruled as such in the NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware in 1982, and you can see for yourself that this issue has been decided, although since it is 40 years old, perhaps it's time to reconsider. We do tend to ossify and calcify laws in this country. Maybe we should look less at precedent and more at righteousness. So with this entire question of incitement, we have to balance it against the First Amendment, and I argue that the First Amendment does protect all speech. I mean, people say you can't shout fire in a crowded movie theater. You can if there is a fire. People say that you can't make complaints about elections being fraudulent. You can. If you believe they were fraudulent, whether they were fraudulent or not, you have the ability to speak freely, or at least you used to have the ability to speak freely. And now with this new law on incitement, if you can be held responsible for anything that anybody does after hearing you speak, free speech will be stifled. There's no way around it. But maybe that's the objective. Maybe our government wants free speech to be stifled. You know, as we fight Republicans versus Democrats, liberals versus conservatives, I will point you to the fact that the elites in this country contribute to both parties and don't really care which party is in power. It's only us scrabbling on the streets that do care, and the only weapon that we have these days to make our positions felt is to use our voice, is to use our First Amendment ability to speak out. If this new effort of using the cudgel of incitement to stifle free expression succeeds, then the First Amendment will be history, along with the Second Amendment, as is the Fourth Amendment already history, and so many more. Please, let's at least reclaim language. Incitement is not a crime. Incitement is fiery rhetoric, and political leaders have been using it since time immemorial. Are we going to ban politics? Are we going to ban speech? If we ban incitement, we might as well ban all speech. Please, let's wake up.